Imagine waking up tomorrow and realizing you have absolutely nowhere to be. No office, no school, no emails, no commute, no appointments. You sit up, look outside, and ask yourself one question. What am I supposed to do today? For most of human history, that question had nothing to do with a job. There were no careers, no salaries, no bosses waiting for you at 9 a.m., and nobody was checking whether you had spent 8 hours being productive. But that doesn't mean ancient humans spent their days doing nothing. They had to find food, make tools, take care of children, prepare meals, build and repair shelters, deal with injuries, watch for danger. So if survival required all of that, what did an actual day look like? The strange part is that we can't give you one perfect schedule. There was no universal ancient routine. A person living near a river, a person following migrating animals, and a person living in a seasonal camp could have completely different days. But anthropologists have spent decades studying the few hunter-gatherer societies that still live partly by these older patterns. And something becomes obvious. Their lives were not divided into the categories we're used to. There wasn't work on one side and life on the other. The two were mixed together. You wake up around sunrise. The camp is already moving. Someone is feeding a fire. Someone is preparing food. Children are running between adults. People are talking about what happened yesterday and what needs to happen today. Nobody needs to schedule a meeting. The meeting is just conversation. Then people begin drifting into different activities. Some leave camp to look for food. Others stay behind. And this is where the modern picture starts to break, because finding food didn't necessarily mean spending the entire day desperately hunting. A 2021 study in Science examined the energetics of subsistence among several contemporary hunter-gatherer populations. And it found something much more complicated than the famous idea that hunter-gatherers simply worked a few hours a day. There was enormous variation. Some groups and individuals spent substantial amounts of time acquiring food. Others had more time available for resting and social activities. The environment mattered, the season mattered, the type of food mattered, and so did what you counted as work. That last part is important. Imagine spending 3 hours walking through a forest with someone you grew up with. You're looking for edible plants. You're also talking. You're teaching a child which plants to recognize. You're carrying a baby. You're collecting material for a basket. Which part was work? There may not have been an answer. The same activity could keep you alive, teach you a skill, strengthen a relationship, and pass knowledge to the next generation at the same time. And children were part of this system from the beginning. A child didn't spend the morning in school learning about how adults lived and then return home to real life. Real life was the school. Research on Hadza children has found that they spend substantial amounts of their day playing, resting, and engaging in leisure. As they grow older, they gradually take on more subsistence activities. A little child might spend hours digging beside an adult. At first, it's play. Then, the child gets better at it. Eventually, the digging becomes useful. The boundary between playing and learning barely exists. And that tells us something important about the ancient day. A lot of time was spent becoming capable, not sitting in a classroom, watching, copying, practicing, making mistakes, following older people around. If you wanted to learn how to make a tool, there was no tutorial waiting on a screen. You watched someone make one. Then you tried. Then you made a terrible version. Then you tried again. And while all of this was happening, people were talking a lot. Because in a small community, knowing other people wasn't just entertainment, it was survival. You needed to know who could be trusted, who was related to whom, who had food, who was angry, who was sick, who needed help, who had a new idea, who was getting married, who had broken a promise, who had brought home something worth sharing. Social life wasn't something you squeezed in after work. Social life was part of how the entire community functioned. And then there was food. When food came back to camp, it often became a social event. A study of food sharing among Hadza children found researchers observing meals directly, including what children brought back from foraging and how that food moved between people. Even children participated in a system where food could be shared rather than treated as completely private property. That makes sense when you think about it. If one person has food today and another person has nothing tomorrow, the safest strategy isn't for everyone to protect whatever they personally have. It's to build a community where people remember who helped them. Your relationships become a kind of insurance. And that means some of your most important daily activities don't produce anything you can hold. You talk, you help someone, you watch someone's child, you teach, you share, you repair an argument, you sit beside someone who's grieving. None of that looks like work, but without it, the group doesn't function. Then the heat arrives. And this is where modern people might have trouble understanding the schedule. You don't necessarily push through. You find shade. You sit down, you eat, you rest, you groom each other, you repair something, you watch children play, you talk, maybe you sleep for a while. And nothing about this is considered wasted time, because the goal isn't to fill every minute. The goal is to live. But there's another question hiding here. If ancient humans really had periods when food was secure and the immediate work was finished, what did they actually do with those empty hours? Because archaeologists have found something that gives us a strange answer. They made things they didn't need, not useless, unnecessary. There's a difference. In the southern Levant, archaeologists have found Neolithic game boards dating back roughly 10,000 years. A 2024 study examined dozens of these boards from sites across the region. Some were carved into stone. Some had associated pieces or markers. And we don't always know exactly how they were used. Some may have been games. Some may have had ritual or divinatory purposes. But either way, the objects tell us something important. People were creating structured activities that existed beyond simply getting food. They were making rules, playing, competing, maybe gambling, maybe trying to predict the future, maybe just wasting an afternoon. And that last possibility is fascinating because we tend to think of leisure as something modern, a video game, a movie, a weekend trip, a hobby you squeeze in after work. But humans clearly didn't invent leisure after inventing offices. We invented offices much later. The ancient world was already full of people finding ways to make time interesting. And some of those activities were even more basic. You could sit around and talk. You could make something beautiful. You could teach a child. You could visit another camp. You could repair your tools even when they weren't immediately broken. You could decorate your body. You could carve something simply because you liked the way it looked. You could play. You could tell a story. And you could do absolutely nothing for a while. That last one may be the hardest for us to imagine because modern life has trained us to treat unused time as a problem. If you're waiting for 5 minutes, you check your phone. If you're sitting on a train, you watch something. If you have a free evening, you make plans. If you're lying in bed awake, you wonder why you're not sleeping. Ancient humans didn't have an endless supply of stimulation waiting in their pockets. The world itself had to provide it. People did. And that may be why social life occupied so much of the day. But there was another major difference. Ancient humans didn't necessarily stay in one place forever. If a relationship became unbearable, if resources shifted, or if a group became too crowded, people could sometimes move. They carried far less with them. Your entire world could fit into things you could carry. That made relationships incredibly important. But it also meant your community was not always a fixed building full of people you were forced to see every morning. You could visit relatives somewhere else, walk to another camp, meet people you hadn't seen for weeks, trade information, exchange objects, arrange marriages, tell stories, then return. Your social world could stretch much farther than the small group sitting around the fire. And this constant movement also meant the landscape itself was part of your life. There was no weekend trip into nature. You lived in it. You knew where water appeared, where certain plants grew, which animals passed through, where storms came from, which paths were safe, which places were good during one season and useless during another. Your environment was not scenery. It was your calendar. And then, thousands of years ago, something began to change. People started planting crops, keeping animals, building permanent settlements. At first, this sounds like the greatest upgrade in human history. More predictable food, more storage, more people. But something else came with it: obligation. Once you plant a field, you have to return to that field. You have to weed it, protect it, harvest it, store it, and wait for the next season. A hunting trip can fail. A field cannot simply be abandoned when you're tired. And we can actually see changes in ancient skeletons. A study comparing Natufian hunter-gatherers with later Neolithic populations in the southern Levant found major changes in health and activity patterns after agriculture. These included increased exposure to infectious disease and changes associated with diet, settlement, and labor. Another study of upper limb stress markers found higher mechanical loads in Neolithic farmers than in the earlier Natufian population. Agriculture didn't simply turn everyone into exhausted farmers overnight. The transition was complicated, but it changed the relationship between humans and time. You had things that had to be done, whether you felt like doing them or not. And once communities became larger, new roles appeared. Someone makes tools. Someone builds houses. Someone organizes food. Someone manages trade. Someone records things. Someone makes laws. Someone fights. Someone rules. Eventually, your contribution can become something separate from the rest of your life, a job. And that is the strange thing about the original question. What did ancient humans do all day without jobs? They did almost everything. They found food. They made things. They repaired things. They raised children. They learned. They played. They visited people. They argued. They rested. They created. They told stories. They sat around doing things that didn't have to justify themselves. But we should be careful about romanticizing it. Ancient life was not a vacation. People died young. Children died. Infections could become fatal. A bad season could mean hunger. A broken bone could become a disaster. Predators existed. There were conflicts. There was fear. Modern humans have gained enormous things that our ancestors would have considered miraculous: medicine, clean water, food preservation, electricity, warm houses, and the ability to survive diseases that once killed entire families. So the point isn't that ancient humans had a better life. It's that they had a completely different relationship with time. For most of human existence, there was no 8-hour block called work, followed by a few hours called personal time. There was just the day. And inside that day, survival, entertainment, education, friendship, childcare, creativity, and rest could all happen at once. A person could spend the morning gathering food, the afternoon making something, and the evening telling a story. None of those activities needed to be called a job. And maybe that's the strangest part. We spend enormous amounts of our lives trying to create enough free time to do the things humans naturally did when they weren't working. We call them hobbies. We call them vacations. We call them quality time. We call them weekends. For most of our history, they were simply life. Ancient humans didn't wake up wondering how to become productive. They woke up wondering what the day required. They didn't wake up trying to make the day count. They woke up and the day was already theirs. Thank you for watching Vinta.